Have you ever wanted to learn the game of chess but didn't know where to start? I've been there too. Trying to figure it out on your own could result in you wasting days or even weeks. That's why I've created this video as a guide to teach beginners how to get started. With over 17 years of experience, I will answer your questions about how to set up the board, how the pieces move, the stages of the game, and how the game ends. Let's first start off with the board. The board is split up into 64 squares, alternating between the dark squares and the light squares. Before any chess game starts, you gotta make sure that you have the bottom right square to be a light square. So for instance, I'm on the black side of things, so the light square is here. On the other end, it would be over here. Sometimes you have to get a board that does not have letters and numbers like this one I have right here. Always remember though, the bottom right has to be light. That's the easiest way to remember it, and it makes sure that your board is always starting off the correct way. For future reference, it's always good to know what the numbers and letters are referred to. The ranks are always the number ones, and then the files are always the ones with the letters. We'll talk more about that in a different video though. Now that you know the board, you're obviously gonna need to add the pieces now. Pawns are the easiest way to start off placing. They go on the second rank or the seventh rank, depending on if they're black or white. It's important to remember that you will always have 8 pawns on each side of the board. Up next, we have the rooks. The rooks are another easy piece to remember because they always go on the ends. On A1, H1, A8, and H8. We also have the knights, often referred to as horses. These go right next to the rooks. Next to the knights go the bishops. They go right here. Last but certainly not least, we have the royalty. We have the king and the queen. A good way to differentiate these is the king often has a cross on his piece versus the queen has a crown. The queens always start on the D file. D1 respectively for white, D8 for black, and the kings always on the E file, E1 and E8. A good rule to remember this, because this can sometimes be confusing, is that the queen's dress always matches her shoes. So the queen is wearing, let's say, a black dress. Her shoes, aka the square she's standing on, will be a black square. Now that you know how the board is set up, let's learn how the pieces move. To make this simple, I'm gonna clear all the pieces off the board, except for the first piece that we're gonna learn, which will be the pawns. Pawns are worth 1 point and can usually only move 1 square at a time. The only exception to this is on their first move. If a pawn wants to capture another piece, they have to do it in a diagonal fashion. A good way that my teacher taught me this when I first learned the game is that pawns are like foot soldiers and they carry shields with them. Imagine whenever you have that shield, you can't stab in front of you because then you would hit your shield. So just you gotta stab diagonally outwards. So pawns would capture diagonally like this. If there are 2 pawns in front of each other, they cannot move because pawns cannot go through other pieces and pieces cannot land on top of others and keep them alive. A special feature that pawns have is the ability to capture en passant. If the opponent moves their pawn 2 squares to avoid getting captured, you can actually still capture it, making this piece disappear. I can't really explain why it's a rule, it just is. Another special rule that only pawns have is their ability to be promoted. When a pawn reaches the other side of the board, for white pieces, this would be the 8th rank, for black pieces, the 1st rank. It can then be turned into any other piece. More often than not, you're gonna wanna choose a queen, but there are sometimes circumstances where you might want to trade into a knight, a rook, or a bishop. Next up, we have the rooks. Rooks are one of the easiest pieces to learn because they have a simple way of movement. They are worth 5 points and they can only go up and sideways. With this, they can also go backwards though, unlike the pawn. And from here on out, every single piece can move backwards. In order to capture a piece with a rook, you have to be within the same rank as them or file. So for instance, this white rook is on the same file as this black rook. So if I want to capture it, I would have to travel all the way here and I would take the space of that piece and that piece is now captured. You cannot jump over pieces with the rook or run through them. You just land wherever the piece ends. Up next, we have the knights. Knights are worth 3 points. Knights are one of the more tricky pieces to remember as they move in an irregular shape. Knights make an L when they move. They go 2 squares up, 1 square to a side. This can go in any direction though, meaning they can go 2 squares to the side, 1 square up. A good rule to remember is the 2 and 1. It's always an L. Here is a good representation of how the knight moves. A special feature that only the knight has is the ability to jump over other pieces. They can do 1, 2, right here, and boom. That is their movement. This is the only piece that can jump over others, but they have to make sure that wherever they're landing on is either occupied by an enemy piece or an empty square. It is impossible to jump and land on your own piece. Similar to rooks, these pieces can also go backwards. Up next, we have the bishops. Bishops move in diagonals and can move as many spaces as they can occupy. Every single game, you'll be given a light squared bishop and a dark squared bishop. No, they're not labeled, but you can always tell by how they're placed whenever the game starts. So this would be the dark square bishop, this would be the light square bishop. Bishops move in diagonals for as much space as they can go, and they cannot jump over other pieces. So for instance, in an open board like this bishop can go to this square, this square, this square, this square, or this square. Same thing goes for this bishop right here. In order to capture, bishops also have to land on the square that they're going to. For instance, this bishop right here, this light square bishop, can go here and capture this piece. Up next, we have the queen. Queens are worth 9 points and are the most powerful piece on the board. They move similar to how rooks do and bishops, in the sense that they can go up and backwards, side to side, but they can also go diagonal now. This allows the queen to be the most versatile piece and is great for attacking. Similar to all the other pieces, the queen cannot jump over other pieces, but whenever they do capture a piece, they will land and replace that square. Last but certainly not least, we have the kings. The king is the most important piece on the board as they have no worth. Kings move in the exact same fashion as the queen, except for the fact that they can move only one square at a time. This means they can either go forward one square, diagonal one square, side to side one square, diagonal again one square, backwards one square, diagonal one square, or to another side one square. They are limited in mobility and are often very, very vulnerable. You got to make sure you keep your king safe throughout the game. Another special thing about the king is the fact that they cannot be captured. Anytime they are threatened, this is called check and you must respond. That means you either have to block the check with another piece, capture the piece that's checking your king, or just move your king to get out of the way. Now that you have a general understanding of how the pieces move, it's also important to understand the stages of the game. A chess game can be broken up into 3 different stages: the opening, the middle game, and the end game. In the opening, you want to make sure you move your pieces away from their starting squares. This is called development. A simple opening for beginners to play that teaches good principles is called a London. You just move your pieces out to active squares, like this, and then you get your king castled. Castling is one of the few moves that actually get to violate the rules of the game. Whenever you castle, you have to make sure that you move your king 2 squares over and then your rook replaces on the other side. This can go for also the opposite side. This would be considered queenside castling. You move your king 2 squares and your rooks will replace it on the other side. The only time you can castle is if your king is not being attacked, you're not castling through an attack, and as long as your king has not moved previously. After you've completed the opening, you're next followed up with the middle game. The middle game is extremely complicated and is what separates the good players from great players. If you want to get good at chess, the middle game is probably where you'll learn the most. It's important to keep playing and to keep learning. A good tip is to watch videos about your opening and the middle game plans that would follow. The last part of a chess game is the end game. The end game is usually signified by there being less pieces on the board, and usually the queens are traded. Oftentimes, the way to win the end game is to move your piece to the opposite side of the board and to promote it. Now that you understand how the pieces move and the stages of the game, let's find out how the game ends. Chess games either end in a win, a draw, or a loss. The most fun way a game can end is checkmate. Checkmate is whenever your king or your opponent's king has no legal squares that it can move to and it's being attacked. A good example would be this position right here. The king, after my next move, would be in checkmate because the queen is now attacking the king. The king cannot capture the queen because it's being protected by the rook. It cannot block the queen because there's no other pieces to block, and it cannot avoid the check as the queen covers all of the available squares. This would signify that the game is over. Another way the game can end is resignation. If you or your opponent don't feel like continuing the game, you can say that you resign, and then the game would be over and the opponent gets to win. A good rule of thumb is to never resign if you're in the lower elo ranges, because more often than not, your opponent probably doesn't know how to checkmate. Another way to win a game is off time. If you or your opponent don't have time on your clock and the opposition has a way to win with checkmate, then they would automatically get this win. Going back to draws, another way that a draw can occur is through stalemate. In this position right here, if it was black to play, they would have a draw now because the king can no longer move to any squares. The king is not being attacked by the rook or the queen. Kings can't attack each other. And let's say you try to make a move with black, this would be walking into check, which you're not allowed to do. Same with here, 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 or here. This would mean that the game ends in a draw. Another way the game could end is through repetition. If you and your opponent repeat the same position 3 times, then this would be considered a draw. The third way a game could end in a draw is through agreement. If you and your opponent decide that the game should be over and that both of you guys don't have a chance to really win or lose, you can just offer a draw and the game will be over. The fourth way a game could end in a draw is through inadequate material. You cannot checkmate the opposing player with just a bishop and a king or just a knight and a king. If you were to have one pawn on the board, this would be considered adequate material, but without the pawn, you cannot make a win. In a similar fashion, draws can even be made if one side has the adequate material to checkmate. Let's say white in this position ran out of time on their clock. Normally, you would think black would automatically get the win because they still have time and the opponent doesn't. However, black does not have the adequate material to checkmate the king, so a draw is automatically given. Last but certainly not least, the sixth way you can draw a game is through the 40 move rule. I will have the rules listed here. And that's it. Now you have a solid foundation to start your chess journey. Whether you're setting up the board for the first time, mastering how the pieces move, or diving into the different stages of the game, you're already on the path to becoming a better chess player. Remember, chess is a game of strategy, learning, and constant improvement. It's not about being perfect. It's all about making progress one move at a time. If you found this video helpful, make sure to give this a thumbs up and subscribe if you want more chess content. I'll be sharing tips, strategies, and insight from my game, so stay tuned. Also, let me know in the comments what part of the game you're excited to learn about next. I'd love to help you take your chess skills to the next level. If you are looking for a simple guide to improve your skills past the beginner level, make sure you check this video right over here. Thanks for watching. Peace.